The coal touched his lips before he understood what was happening to him. One moment Isaiah was a man collapsing under the weight of his own smallness, certain the breath in his lungs was borrowed time in a room too holy for breathing. The next, a burning thing, carried from an altar he could not look at directly, rested against his mouth, and a voice told him his guilt was gone. To understand how a man arrives at a moment like that, you have to go back to what he saw first and what he heard before he ever felt the fire. He had been standing, or perhaps kneeling, he could never afterwards say which, in a temple that had stopped behaving like a building. The foundations shifted under a sound too large to be called singing. Smoke curled through the air, not from any fire he could name, thick enough to blur the edges of a throne set impossibly high above him, and around that throne, not beneath it, not guarding it from a respectful distance, but hovering directly over it, close enough to be scorched by whatever sat there, were beings unlike anything Isaiah had words for. Later scribes would call them Seraphim, from a root meaning to burn, and the name fit before anyone explained why. Each had 6 wings, and the arrangement was the first thing that unsettled him. 2 wings folded up and over the face, 2 folded down across the feet. Only the last pair moved, holding each creature aloft in restless, ready flight. Isaiah would spend the rest of his life turning that image over. Beings who stood nearer to God than anything else in creation, and who used most of their wings not to fly, not to act, but to hide. He came to understand it as a kind of confession written in feathers. Even fire this pure did not consider itself fit to look upon the source of its own burning. The hidden feet were something else again. A quiet admission that no matter how high a creature stood, its origin was still dust, still the ground, still something to be covered rather than displayed. Only the wings left free were the ones built for obedience, and even those, he noticed, never seemed to rest. Then came the sound that broke something open in him. The seraphim called to each other, not down to Isaiah, not even fully into the world he stood in, but across the space between themselves, as if the praise existed for its own sake, and he was only permitted to overhear it. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, 3 times, and Isaiah would later insist that no one who has not heard something said 3 times in that register understands what repetition can do. Once is a statement, twice is emphasis. 3 times, in the language his ancestors used to speak of the unspeakable, is the closest a human sentence can come to infinity, and then the beings added something that unsettled him more than the fire had. The whole earth, they said, is full of his glory. Not the temple, not the throne room, the earth, his farm, his village, his ordinary aching life, apparently soaked in the same glory he could barely survive standing near. It was the sound of that praise, shaking the pillars around him, that finally broke Isaiah open. He heard himself say the thing every honest person says when confronted with something larger than their excuses, that he was ruined, unclean, a man of unclean lips living among people just as compromised. He expected judgment. What came instead was the coal. One seraph broke from the formation, crossed the impossible distance between the throne and the trembling prophet, and pressed fire to his mouth. Not to punish the lips that had spoken carelessly for years, but to burn the guilt out of them. Purified, the creature told him. Atoned for. Not because he had earned it in that moment, but because the beings closest to holiness apparently understood something about it that he didn't yet. That holiness, when it finally reaches you, arrives not to condemn but to remake. Isaiah carried that moment for the rest of his life, and so did everyone who ever tried to explain what he saw. Generations later, when theologians began sorting the unseen world into some kind of order, they kept returning to a question his vision never quite answered. What made these particular beings the highest of all? Not the archangels who walk among ordinary lives, guiding and protecting. Not the powers and dominions said to govern the turning of seasons and the machinery of the cosmos. Not even the cherubim, so often paired with the seraphim in the old texts, whose gift was understanding, the deep, patient unraveling of divine mystery through knowledge. The seraphim held no such portfolio. They carried no message, ruled no domain, explained nothing. Their entire rank rested on a single, almost unbearably simple fact: proximity. They were closest to the fire because they were the fire in whatever sense a created being can be. The medieval scholar Thomas Aquinas, writing centuries after Isaiah's temple had turned to rubble and memory, tried to put a name to what made that closeness possible. He argued that the seraphim knew God more completely than any other order, not because they studied him from a distance, the way a scholar studies a text, but because love itself was their instrument of understanding. They did not learn holiness, they burned with it, and in burning, they saw further than knowledge alone could ever reach. Other mystics went further still. Writers working under the name of Dionysius the Areopagite described the Seraphim as beings who had, in a sense, stopped being separate individuals at all, dissolved willingly into the larger flame of divine love, the way a single ember loses its outline once it joins a greater fire. It is a strange kind of highest rank, not command, not visibility, not even action in the way most stories understand action, just an unbroken, wordless nearness that radiates outward and asks nothing in return. What stays with people, centuries after Isaiah first told this story, isn't really the wings or the smoke, it's the order of operations. The Seraphim do not act first and explain later. They do not descend to fix the world the way other messengers might. Their entire existence is worship, offered so completely that it becomes almost indistinguishable from being itself, and only after all that unbroken adoration does one of them turn, coal in hand, toward a terrified man who thought he had nothing to offer. There is something almost paradoxical in that stillness. Beings who never rest and yet never seem to hurry, whose highest form of service turns out to be attention rather than motion. Maybe that's the part worth carrying out of a temple that no longer exists, and into a Tuesday that very much does, that the beings who stood closest to the fire were not the ones who acted the most, but the ones who paid the closest attention, and let that attention become the whole of who they were. If you found something in that stillness worth sitting with, stay a while longer, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which corner of the unseen you want uncovered next.